This is a pirate. This is also a pirate. But this is most often recognized as the only pirate. But why? What makes them so distinct? It is said that piracy has been since men first traveled by water. It has existed across the world and time, but to most people, pirate has come to mean the colonial pirates and privateers active during the so-called Golden Age of Piracy. You know, black flags, flintlock pistols, cutlasses, that sort of thing, not falchions or samurai armor. Some define the period rather nichely as occurring between 1715 and 1725, being the heyday of legends like Blackbeard. Others pull it further back to somewhere in the mid-1600s and late 1720s, involving figures like Henry Morgan and Henry Every. The scope of this video will be limited to this latter, wider period. Preferably, the pirates of this era would have a unique name to separate them from other historical pirates. They did have several names to distinguish them, they just aren't very well known. However, what ultimately allows us to consider the pirates of this defined period as a single group, distinct from earlier, later, and other contemporary groups of pirates, are that they operated in a largely identical manner. They used the same types of ships, and though there were obvious shipbuilding developments, they largely remained the same from the start to the end. They used the same technology and tactics, which were again distinct from other groups in history. They also organized themselves in a distinct manner, and were driven by distinct motivations. Whilst their operations were usually illegal, they had a great need for legitimacy and legal pretense. A brief note on the phrase Golden Age of Piracy is likewise necessary. I primarily use it for the sake of convenience, but it does have a few faults. As mentioned earlier, the pirates of this period should really have a separate name, largely because many of them weren't technically pirates, the definition of which was very vague back then. Golden Age also serves to glorify a period which wasn't marked by a development of outstanding art and literature, like say the Spanish Golden Age, but by rampant robbery, murder, torture, rape, and enslavement. In some of my videos I call it the Age of Piracy, but again, for the sake of discussion you have to abide by convention and convenience, two things which walk hand in hand. You can't go around deconstructing and critiquing everything, especially if something has a necessary purpose. This addendum was also recorded during my recovery from a wisdom tooth extraction, so I apologize for sounding a bit effed up. Please enjoy the video. The pirates of the Golden Age did not come out of nowhere. European contact with the Americas has been tied to piracy since its very inception. The first European that could be considered a colonial pirate was Christopher Columbus himself. In 1502, on his fourth voyage to the Americas, he came upon a large indigenous trading canoe, robbing its cargo of primarily cacao beans. In 1494, 2 years after the discovery of the Americas, the Treaty of Tordesillas declared that all land west of the line of demarcation belonged to the Spanish monarchy. Any non-Spanish European who set his foot on their possessions was immediately declared a pirate. One could say that the Golden Age of Piracy had begun before it truly had. It just lay there waiting. Spain was unable to keep its rivals from entering the New World. In 1523, Norman Corsair John Fleury captured several Spanish ships off Cape St. Vincent in southern Portugal. Though the attack did not occur in the Americas themselves, the ships carried a portion of Aztec treasure stolen from Montezuma by the conquistadors. This was the beginning of a series of non-Spanish intrusions into the Americas. The French were soon joined by the Dutch watergeuzen, sea beggars, and the English sea dogs. What distinguished all of these Corsairing groups was their religion. Whether French Huguenots, English Anglicans, or Dutch Calvinists, they all adhered to the recently reformed denominations of Christianity, and couldn't be considered anything but anti-Catholic zealots. However, the Corsairs did not only enter the New World to raid and pillage. Most of the time, they were heavily armed smugglers. Spain enforced a strict trading policy, and some of their isolated colonies were glad to make commerce with outsiders. If they refused, well, the Corsairs had the guns to force them. Trade and violence was pretty much bread and butter back in those days. Men like Francis Drake and Martin Frobisher were not pirates first and foremost, but merchants, very often slave traders, since the early Spanish colonies had a great demand for slaves. They did, however, carry letters of marque, allowing them to legally capture enemy ships. What differed the pirates of the 16th century from the later ones apart from the obvious differences in fashion and technology, was that they operated abroad without a permanent set of bases in the colonies. It is one of the deciding factors of the Golden Age of Piracy. Pirates had permanent colonial bases where they enjoyed popular support of their actions. Such a period had occurred in Europe. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, the Baltic Sea was a battleground between merchants and pirates of different nations. This age of Baltic piracy ended in the 16th century, with the rise of Sweden and Denmark as two naval powers able to control the inland sea. In England, the government was able to crack down on piratical support in Ireland and the West Country. This medieval and Renaissance process would then have to repeat itself for the colonies during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Colonialism itself was closely interconnected with smuggling, piracy, and slavery. The early English colonies of Jamestown and Bermuda both deployed private men of war in times of peace to plunder from the Spanish. These colonies had a need for a rapid cash influx to fund construction and agricultural expansion. Slaves were a necessity in this endeavor, not only as a labor force. They were primarily taken from Spanish and Portuguese possessions, not straight from Africa, and they were vital in teaching the English on how to cultivate tobacco. It could be argued that the Golden Age of Piracy began with the first English-American colonies. However, these colonies would only play a minor role in piracy in the mid to late 17th century, and piracy in the early days would not form a focal point of their industry. Instead, the Golden Age as we knew it likely began in 1629 with the settling of Tortuga. Tortuga is a small island shaped like a turtle, situated off the northern coast of Hispaniola. The Spanish had released pigs and cattle on islands like these to supply future settlers with food. Since the 1570s, Corsairs had landed on these islands to hunt for provisions. The meat was cut into long, thin strips and cured in Arawak fashion over a wooden grill called boucan. Thus, these hunters earned the title of boucanier in French, anglicized into buccaneer. In 1629, the Spanish attacked the French colony on St. Kitts. 200 refugees arrived on Tortuga, regarded as a safe haven. The buccaneers had long since established themselves on the island. The various settlers organized themselves into three groups: the farmers, habitants, the hunters, boucaniers, and the pirates, filibusters. They operated very closely together, amassing trade goods, acquiring money and provisions, and conducting trade. They switched between professions, and two men would often join into a mateletage, a sort of bond in which they shared their economy and diversified. At some point they organized themselves into the Brethren of the Coast. Together they drafted their Custom of the Coast, an unwritten law which dictated how they would settle disputes and organize their maritime expeditions. It would form the basis of later pirate articles, and pirate crews would abide by the custom throughout the Golden Age. It was never written down, but remembered by veterans and passed down orally to the next generations. Each vessel did, however, have its own articles of agreement, which dictated the rules of an individual ship, payment being most important. Throughout the entire age, pirates would only accept their pay in equal shares of the plunder. The Brethren primarily preyed on Spanish shipping in the passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. They would often use small canoes and piraguas, often mistaken for fishing boats at a distance. Closing in, they either boarded their unsuspecting prey or gunned them down with muskets. The many hunters among them were expert marksmen. The Spanish were not exactly glad to have a pirate settlement right on their doorstep. Tortuga became the scene of a bloody back-and-forth fighting throughout the 1630s and 40s. We know rather accurately what the pirates of this era looked like. Settlers, filibusters, and buccaneers alike dressed in drawers and a shirt. The buccaneers made savage shoes from fresh pork hides. Popular was a hat with its brim cut into a screen, like a modern baseball cap. It would remain popular well into the 1700s. Neither were they exclusively French, but a mishmash of European nationalities, even escaped slaves and people of mixed descent. There were some important technological innovations during this period. Most important was the flintlock musket. Armies of the time used the expensive and unwieldy matchlock. The flintlock was more suited for the guerrilla-style campaigns of the American colonies, and a safer and better weapon in general. It appears as though settlers adapted it in the 1640s, with the buccaneers among them. Pirates and colonies adapted flintlocks far ahead of European armed forces, and it would remain the pirate's favorite weapon throughout the entire Golden Age, owing to its extreme flexibility and reliability. The flintlock revolution also led to pistols becoming more available. Even in the 1620s and 30s, when the flintlock was new, there are documentations of settlers and pirates being equipped with pistols, which, while not as flexible as the musket, were an essential weapon for boarding combat. Another important innovation was the cartridge and cartridge box. Traditionally, muskets had been reloaded with priming powder from a horn, main charge from a wooden flask, and bullet from a bag. The paper cartridge combined all three into a single unit. They were kept inside of a cartridge box for easy access, safety, and faster reloading. Some would still retain the bandolier and powder flasks, but as a whole, flintlock, cartridge, and box became the standard equipment for the Golden Age pirate. In 1654, Tortuga had been thrown into disarray after the murder of its pirate dictator, Jean Levasseur. The island was unable to defend itself against a Spanish conquest. The buccaneers were run out, and in need of a new home. In 1655, an English expedition failed to take the island of Hispaniola. Instead, they conquered Jamaica and made it an English colony. Needing able men to defend them, bring in money and hunt for provisions, they invited the buccaneers to join them. They were not only used for hunting wild cattle on Jamaica, but also the Spanish guerrillas remaining on the island. The buccaneers were experts at jungle and swamp fighting, and they were often invited by governors to put down slave rebellions and indigenous tribes. For the purpose of tracking, the buccaneers made good use of dogs. The main port of English Jamaica, Port Royal, would also become a staging point for maritime assaults against Spanish possessions. The Jamaican governors would freely hand out commissions, permitting independent captains to privateer against the Spanish. Some of the captains were English gentlemen. A large number among the ranks were the old filibusters and buccaneers. But they also consisted of veteran soldiers, militiamen, and regular sailors. They would all inherit the military tactics of the old hunters and veterans, and in English, the collective term for these ragtag rovers became buccaneer. Several things distinguishes the buccaneers from other groups of pirates. Though they always made legal pretensions, they were oftentimes illegal and operated during peacetime. They exclusively attacked the Spanish, and they conducted most of their operations by land, typically moving to an area by boat, making landfall, then marching on a castle or city to take it by force. Owing to their training and equipment, they were highly effective and profitable. The Spanish were poorly trained, were poorly equipped with firearms, and mostly used the old matchlock. And though many of their operations were illegal, especially in the upcoming centuries, the buccaneers were able to carry them out because they received local, popular support. If a port was under threat of Spanish assault, then a heavily armed force of pirates was necessary for its defense. On Jamaica, plunder was used to fund construction projects and agricultural expansion. Stolen slaves were used as labor, especially in the burgeoning sugar industry. The most notable name of this period is Henry Morgan, who himself would retire as a landholder and lieutenant governor of Jamaica. This period came to an end in 1671, when England and Spain signed a peace treaty. Attacking the Spanish was now outlawed. The word buccaneer would take on an edgy connotation, and English buccaneers would prefer to call themselves privateers instead. It was during this era that the word came to be. It's short for private man-of-war, an armed fighting ship independent of the Royal Navy, mostly used for attacking enemy commerce or hunting pirates. Jamaica would make some paltry attempts at quelling its buccaneering activities. The governors tried to give the buccaneers alternative employment. Some would return to hunting. Others would become logwood cutters in Campeche. Many turned to the sloop trade, an illicit commerce conducted between Jamaica and the Spanish colonies. Slaves stolen from Spanish ships were the primary trade good. The Spanish received their slaves through the Netherlands, which possessed a Spanish monopoly, called the asiento. Essential to the sloop trade was, of course, the sloop. This was the most popular pirate vessel in this period, and up until the end. It seems to have been invented sometime in the 1680s or 70s, but predecessors existed, and were used by pirates. It was a small and very fast vessel that carried a limited amount of cannon, and bore one or two masts. Royal Navy sloops sometimes had three. They were also equipped with oars, allowing them to move in calm winds. Cheap, flexible, fast. It was the most used vessel of the Golden Age. From the Caribbean to the Red Sea, pirate and sloop should be synonymous. Those who wished to continue buccaneering turned instead to its cradle, Hispaniola, and the French colony of Saint-Domingue, specifically the city of Petit-Goâve. For the next 17 years, this haven would become the beating heart of New World piracy. Regardless of nationality, any pirate could buy himself a cheap commission from the governor and sign his name, becoming a legal privateer. For the English it was illegal to sail under a foreign commission, but few of the buccaneers cared. To the French, the buccaneers were distinguished from the hunters by being called filibusters, filibusters. Saint-Domingue would exploit the buccaneers in a similar manner to Jamaica. Their plunder was used to invest in the agricultural and infrastructural expansion of the growing colony, and slaves were taken as a common plunder and put to work. Buccaneers were invited to settle down. As hunters they formed a vital part of the economy, and they could also be called upon as a military force to defend the colony, join military campaigns, or put down slave revolts. A few buccaneers even became governors of Saint-Domingue, like Jean-Baptiste de Ducasse. In response to Anglo-French piracy, smuggling and logwood cutting, the Spanish organized the Guardacosta, Coast Guard. Local governors could commission a captain to acquire a small galley or piragua, hire a crew, and patrol the coasts for heretics. More often than not, the Garda behaved like pirates themselves and attacked neutral merchants, often as retaliation. In return, the French and English would retaliate against the Spanish. A vicious cycle spun hotly in the Caribbean. For some buccaneers, the Caribbean was growing too hot. In 1679, a fleet organized by Bartholomew Sharp and John Coxon sailed to the Isthmus of Panama. They abandoned their boats and rowed up the river to the Pacific Ocean, where they stole a Spanish ship and began ravaging the South American coast. The American Pacific was largely unknown to anyone but the Spanish, virtually unprotected, and ripe with silver from the mines of Potosi. This first expedition resulted in a meager profit, but it led to a surge in piratical activity in the American Pacific. French and English captains alike would cross the isthmus or sail around the end of South America, attacking towns and ships alike, going so far as Mexico and California. Some would attempt to capture the Manila galleon, delivering produce between Asia and Mexico. Some of these South Seamen would even cross the Pacific and ravage across Asia and the Philippines. One crew even visited Australia. While most pirates preferred the nimble sloop, the South Seamen preferred to use large, full-rigged ships with a displacement of between 150 to 500 tons burthen. Sloops were surprisingly seaworthy even on longer interoceanic voyages, but a proper ship could carry more provisions, plunder, crewmen, artillery, and even sail faster. It was often a goal of any pirate throughout the period to secure a full-rigged ship and modify her. They reduced weight and improved speed by knocking down internal partitions and shaving down the upper structures. Additional gun ports, artillery, and swivels were added, and some even modified the rigging. These large pirate flagships were frequently called men of war. Some had been purpose-built privateers, like Henry Every's Fancy. Others were speedy merchants like the Blessed Trinity or Signet. Others had been former slave ships, like the Bachelor's Delight, Speaker, and Queen Anne's Revenge. This part of the Golden Age is so interesting, because it is the most well documented. Individual buccaneers provided extensive journals, in which they documented their adventures and the sights they saw. Many of them were avid explorers, navigators, and natural scientists. The journals and accounts give us a deep insight into the colorful characters present during this period, and this chapter contains the highest concentration of truly epic individuals. Laurens de Graaf, who had his own orchestra, Bartholomew Sharp, the legendary gambler, the coconut-obsessed William Dampier, Chevalier Gramont, who commanded buccaneer cavalry, or John Hamlin, a reckless madman who brazenly declared himself a pirate and war against the entire world. These are but a selective sample. It was also during this time that European pirates were first documented as using the skull and bones. In 1688, French filibusters led by Francisco Franco in Mexico flew a red banner with a white skull and crossbones when attacking the Spanish. This period was defined by the prominence of Petit-Goâve and of the buccaneers. Then, 1688 is a perfect end date. Petit-Goâve was attacked by the Guardacosta in 1687 as a retaliation for its pirate activities. Pirates have been mythologized for liberating slaves, something they never did, though the Guardacosta and Spanish Corsairs did liberate Spanish-speaking people of color from Petit-Goâve and from other non-Spanish pirates and slavers. France had likewise made peace with Spain, and was going through the same crackdown process that Jamaica had been attempting for the last 17 years. However, the French process was more gradual and ultimately more successful, with their filibusters largely being painlessly incorporated into French colonial society. But perhaps most importantly, war broke out between England and France in 1688. This put an end to the cooperation between filibusters and buccaneers, who were now at each other's throats. Having spent the last few decades fighting the Spanish together, the French and English buccaneers were now enemies. They would conduct similar amphibious raids on each other. Most prominent was the French attack on Jamaica, during which they focused on ransacking plantations and stealing slaves. The English made a counterattack on Saint-Domingue, but it wasn't especially successful. Some of the old buccaneers were not content with stealing from the Spanish, the French, or the English. Just like the sea dogs of the previous century, the buccaneers had largely been motivated by religion. Though Catholicism was often viewed as the antagonist first and foremost, many believed Islam to be the true enemy. Many European countries, including England and even New England, suffered at the hands of the Muslim Barbary Corsairs. Some of those buccaneers who had gone via South America through the Pacific and into Asia realized a profit could be had from piracy in the Indian Ocean. In the late 1680s and early 1690s, they began outfitting ships for the so-called pirate round, a long voyage across the Atlantic, around Africa, and into the Indian Ocean. After resupplying at Madagascar, they attacked pilgrim ships in the Red Sea and returned home. Their combat expertise from decades of fighting the Spanish allowed them to conquer ships many times their size. They were known as the Red Seamen. Two places were vital to their operations. Firstly was New England, where they outfitted their ships, mustered their crews, and received commissions. New York was the capital of Red Sea piracy. In these communities, the pirates would also marry, buy property, retire, and fence their loot. Gold and silver was melted down by silversmiths into new items, which might then be melted down again and minted into new coins someplace else. Second was Madagascar. The local inhabitants were glad to sell provisions and prostitute their women in return for guns and ammunition. A New York merchant named Adam Baldridge, an old buccaneer himself, had likewise built a trading post on St. Mary's Island, on the east coast of Madagascar. From here, ships from New York could carry supplies for the pirates in return for loot and locally captured slaves. Many of the pirates would ally with the local tribes in their conflicts and take prisoners of war as slaves to be sold. The greatest exploit of the Red Seamen was by Henry Every, when he captured the Gunsway in 1695. This sparked an international manhunt, which led to a crackdown of piracy in the colonies and Indian Ocean. New laws were drafted, new governors put in place. However, the people of the colonies would still support piracy, as they still stood to benefit from it. It is not fully certain if the Red Seamen looked too different from the earlier buccaneers. They would still use the same shirts, jackets, similar broad-brimmed hats, linen caps, and so on. The flintlock musket was still their favorite weapon, and they used it to great effect when capturing Indian ships. However, they would engage in cannon battles at sea much more than the buccaneers. It is also possible that they incorporated more local cloths and fashion pieces into their wear. It is known that they brought home products like silk and especially flower-patterned calico, which was then made into fashionable coats and waistcoats, which they wore in New England. The last true buccaneer attack is often regarded as the raid on Cartagena in 1697, during which a French naval force was augmented by a score of filibusters. After the city had been sacked, the navy left with their loot without paying the filibusters. The filibusters returned to the city and sacked it a second and even more brutal time. However, this should not be considered the end of the filibusters. Their activities would continue into the next chapter. Piracy was largely non-existent between 1701 and 1713. A few remnants continued to ravage in the Indian Ocean, most prominent being John Bowen and his heavily armed ship, the Speaker. In the brief interwar period between 1697 and 1701, a few French filibusters kept attacking the English and Spanish. In the year 1700, one of them was documented as flying a black flag with a skull and bones, and an hourglass underneath. This is the first known occurrence of pirates using a black flag with mortuary motifs. Around the year 1709, a French flag book associated the traditional Jolly Roger with the filibusters. In 1700, a member of the French royal family became King of Spain, leading to the possibility of an unstoppable union. This rallied the rest of Europe into a war to maintain the balance of power, called the War of Spanish Succession. For the next 12 years, pirates would have no trouble finding legal and profitable employment as privateers. One can still find the old buccaneers participating in this conflict. William Dampier, a buccaneer explorer that had visited almost every corner of the world, received a privateering commission in 1703. Sailing once more into the South American Pacific, he failed to take any major prizes, and was eventually deposed in a mutiny. Dampier is a perfect example of how the older pirate generations passed on their knowledge to the next. He began his career as a Campeche Bay man in the 1670s, before joining the first buccaneering expedition to the South Sea in 1679. There he learned skills from men who had sailed with Morgan. Dampier would then go on to meet Henry Every, become a captain in his own right, and in 1707 he was back in Bristol, this time earning employment under Captain Woodes Rogers. Rogers' privateering crews would return them to Dampier's old haunts in South America, raiding the cities of Puna on April 20th of 1708, Guayaquil on the 4th of May, and on the 22nd of December they took the Manila galleon. There is a common misconception that the French filibusters simply disappeared. They didn't. Throughout the War of Spanish Succession, they launched their own small raids and organized expeditions, but had primarily been incorporated into standing French forces. In 1706, they partook in raids on St. Kitts and Nevis. In 1702 they took Curaçao, Montserrat, and Suriname, taking loot and ransoms. The same applied for the English buccaneers and American-based privateers. Though Port Royal had been destroyed in 1692 in an earthquake, Jamaica would remain a staging point for privateering and naval assaults, but they accomplished less than the other groups mentioned. Instead, many of the English privateering expeditions were organized out of England itself, especially the city of Bristol. On the French side, Corsairing ventures primarily traveled out of the island of Malo. This is not to say that these places had not been used for privateering previously. Malo had been an active privateering hub for the entire period. René du Guestroy could be considered the French equivalent of Woodes Rogers. Among his many deeds, he led an expedition in 1711 against Rio de Janeiro, Portuguese Brazil. Slaves made up a huge part of the plunder, which were later sold to the French colonies. It is ironic that the French filibusters had been some of the most brutal raiders of the South American Pacific. But after the sudden Franco-Spanish alliance, the markets of New Spain were now opened up. Many of the filibusters became merchants instead, trading in the cities they once had sacked, and some of them were even delegated to protecting them from English privateers. The war came to an end in 1713. One of the most important resolutions was that Great Britain was awarded the asiento, the Spanish monopoly contract of selling slaves to Spain's colonies. This completely neutered the illicit slave trade going on in Jamaica, in which Jamaica-based buccaneers and privateers would capture Dutch slave ships, sell the slaves in Jamaica, from whence they were smuggled to Spanish plantations. By this point it was a known fact that a great deal of privateers would turn to piracy in a post-war period. The Netherlands and France dealt with it skillfully by granting sailors special boons like exclusive fishing rights and pensions. The English had not found a working solution, which played a part in the surge of piracy during this period. But it wasn't the sole cause. Many of the American privateers did turn to peaceful work after the war, and only turned to piracy after a few years. In 1713, former privateer Benjamin Hornigold established Nassau on New Providence as a pirate base, using it to stage small-scale attacks on Spanish shipping and plantations. It wasn't until 1715 that Nassau would blossom and begin the true Golden Age of Piracy, or as I like to call it, the Age of the Marooners. In 1715, the Spanish treasure fleet was wrecked off the coast of Florida. Pirates rose up from nowhere and began crowding the wrecks, diving themselves or robbing the Spanish salvage operation. The governor of Jamaica commissioned a privateer fleet to protect Spanish salvors from piracy. Their secret goal was to take treasure themselves. Their leader was Commodore Henry Jennings. After a successful raid on Florida, the conspiracy was eventually discovered. The governor was arrested, and Jennings forced to take refuge in Nassau. The population of Nassau had now grown to around 1,000, both pirates and various tradesmen, smugglers and prostitutes, seeking to satisfy the pirates' needs. These pirates operated under different captains, among whom Jennings and Hornigold were the most powerful, styling themselves commodores. Though the pirates lacked a state, they referred to themselves collectively as the Flying Gang. Neither would the pirates refer to themselves as pirates, but prefer the old title of privateer, and when it didn't work, they styled themselves as Marooners, because they frequently deployed marooning as a punishment for internal crimes, which is why I refer to this period as the Marooners' Golden Age. The Marooners could be distinguished from earlier pirates by their dictatorial behavior. They did not allow crewmen to come and go as they pleased. Many in their numbers had been press-ganged, since piracy was not the lucrative profession it once had been. Neither were you allowed to leave until the voyage was considered complete. Many of the captains assumed strict authority, and they deployed crueler methods to preserve internal discipline, such as torture and psychology. The Marooners were seemingly also the first English pirates to use the black flag. They began depicting it with other symbols like skeletons and weaponry. However, they would not outperform their predecessors. They would not take on massive ships, engage in great battles, or conquer cities. The battlefield expertise of the buccaneers had been lost, and the Marooners were able to make most of their enemies surrender without a fight. They're best compared to armed robbers. Though a few of them managed to beat back pirate hunters, most of them when cornered, especially by the navy, would be bested without much of a struggle. The dress and fashion of the Marooners appears to have differed slightly from the previous generations. They could still be distinguished from regular seamen by the amount of weapons and implements they carried. It seems like the Marooners preferred to not wear the patterned shirts favored by regular seamen, rather plain white shirts enjoyed by the upper class. They saw themselves as princes above men. They also placed a larger emphasis on the pistol over the musket, and it is possible that they showed off their pistols by wearing them in a silk sling. This period would come to an end in 1718, when all of the pirates were offered royal pardons. The Florida wrecks had begun to run dry of silver, and the pirates were able to keep what they had stolen. Nassau was taken by the British without a fight, and prominent pirates like Charles Vane, Stede Bonnet, and Blackbeard were hunted down and killed. War broke out with Spain in 1719, allowing the pardoned pirates a new source of legal employment. Some would continue to fly the black flag. They would simply have to do it elsewhere. It is interesting that many of the Marooners birthed in this period, and the next appear to have risen up out of a confused view of reality. They still believe that they lived in the old buccaneering days, during which they could steal from the French, Spanish, and even the English without impunity, and then sell down in local communities. That they could kidnap slaves and sell them for a profit. But this was not the case. The population, and especially colonial governments, had grown more resentful towards pirates, and plantations saw the supply of slaves met by a legal slave trade. Trade had also opened up with the Spanish. There was simply no need for pirates, and thus they had no home. They were really the last gasp of an era long gone. A great number of the old Marooners decided to sail east, across the Atlantic. First they ravaged around West Africa, before crossing the Cape of Good Hope and entering the Indian Ocean, much like the Red Seamen whom they wanted to replicate. They were men like Edward England, Olivier Levasseur, Christopher Condent, and Richard Taylor. What distinguished this group of Marooners from the earlier one was that they used larger ships more fitting for the open ocean. They also had to carry more supplies and stay at sea for longer periods, since they didn't have any friendly ports to dock in. A lot of the Marooners active in the Indian Ocean also appeared to have been more proficient fighters, and many seemed to have been former Navy men. Madagascar was revived as a pirate stronghold, but it would not flourish as it had under Baldridge's oversight. Some of the old pardoned pirates would return to their old trade, others rose up in mutinies, and others came out of nowhere. But along the line, it appears as though every known Marooner company of this period was somehow connected by one or more individuals to the original Nassau flying gang. Olivier Levasseur, who sailed with Taylor, had sailed with Bellamy, who had been under Hornigold. So a lot of the old customs and traditions were passed on. It's very possible that some of the Marooners even had connections to the old buccaneers, but I digress. Though the Marooners in the Indian Ocean saw great success, capturing some of the wealthiest prizes in all of history and peacefully retiring, the Marooners that rose up around and stayed in West Africa and the Americas were not very successful, though some of them, like Bartholomew Roberts, took many ships and rich prizes. Most of them didn't, and all of them ended up dead in battle or at the end of a noose. As the years progressed, fewer and fewer pirates started appearing. The last great Marooner was Edward Lowe, who disappeared in 1724. By 1730, the Golden Age of Piracy was over. In the previous year, John Thomas Delane was arrested, a pirate known for his strange flag and for hiding his treasure. 1730 marks the death of Olivier Levasseur, one of the period's most iconic names. Though he had received a pardon a few years earlier, he was arrested again on weak charges and executed simply to prove a point: that law and order had been established, and piracy quelled. Taking a zoomed-out look on the different chapters of the Golden Age, a few conclusions can be drawn as to what caused piracy, and what solutions, direct and indirect, led to its downfall. Piracy in the colonial world was largely caused by markets being closed off or monopolized. The Spanish did not allow anyone to trade with their colonies, or their colonies to do trade, so there was a demand for Spanish goods and a demand among those colonies for goods. Both demands could only be met by piracy and smuggling. Likewise, the burgeoning colonies of New England, Jamaica and Saint-Domingue needed slaves to expand their agriculture, but the monopolized slave trade was too small to supply them, so they needed piracy against other nations' plantations and slave ships. Likewise, the trade of West African and, to a greater extent, East Indian trade goods was monopolized by national companies. The demand was greater than the supply, and it could only really be met by smuggling or piracy, which also lowered the prices. So how was this solved? Trade with Spain was opened up for the French and English. The African companies lost their monopolies on the slave trade, and free traders were given access to West Africa and the Indian Ocean. Pirates could flourish in the colonies because they had ports in which they were supported, allowing them to receive protection, repairs, and supplies. Corrupt, pro-piracy governors were replaced by hardliners. Next, the population had to be pulled in line. Mass media like books and especially broadside ballads that villainized pirates were published. When printing houses were opened up in the colonies in the 1690s, newspapers could share the depredations of piracy, their crimes against humanity, how they attacked people of their own country, and how they harmed the economy. When people went to church, they could listen to their preacher condemning piracy, where his predecessors had previously praised it, against the Catholics and Islam. Finally, pirates were being curtailed by being given well-paying legal jobs in the merchant and fishing industries, by receiving pardons for their crimes and being promoted to settle down and marry into local populations. Those that remained were hunted down and killed. Piracy didn't vanish, of course, but it would never rise to its previous extent. Not for a while, at least. During peacetime, merchant ships would require less weaponry and smaller crews to defend themselves against pirate attacks. This allowed for an expansion of trade fleets and commerce in general, leading to bigger prosperity in the 18th century. Commerce raiding would primarily be relegated to wartime privateering, which, though still morally and legally questionable, was more regulated than in the 17th century. Many of the old Marooners would even partake as privateers in the War of Jenkins' Ear, and someone allegedly spotted Edward Lowe manning a Spanish cannon in Portobello, 1739. The old order would be shaken up in 1775, and the American War of Independence. Both Britain and the United States would deploy privateers against each other. This would be the beginning of a new golden age of piracy, in which privateering, piracy, and smuggling flourished. Privateers would be deployed by the nascent Republic of Haiti, and they might very well have liberated black slaves, unlike their predecessors. But the greatest wave of piracy would spring up from the independence of the Spanish colonies. The flow of piracy in the early 19th century was massive, and the actors much more brutal than the ones a century prior. It would require considerable effort from the young United States to put it down. Many of our modern ideas of pirates, like them forcing victims to walk the plank, originates from this early 19th century neo-Golden Age, which authors like Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Treasure Island, was more familiar with than the true Golden Age. The pirates of this era may also have liberated slaves, as abolitionism had become a widely held opinion, in addition to rebellious, revolutionary ideas of egalitarianism. Again, something that were practiced by the old buccaneers, Red Sea men, and Marooners, who were slavers and religious extremists. There were of course a lot of details I had to leave out of this video, which is already my longest video published so far. I would have liked to talk more about the contemporary literature and media influences on piracy, much of which was made by pirates themselves. And the video was only able to skim through the different chapters of the Golden Age of Piracy. Of course, I intend to discuss each of them more in depth. I previously covered the Buccaneers in some old videos, but I intend to remaster them next year. In the coming months I will cover the Red Sea men extensively. As for the periods outside of the Golden Age, I intend to make annual video series of around 10 to 12 episodes, covering those mentioned here, and actually a few other ones, though I won't go earlier than 1492, and probably not later than 1820. The first series is hopefully coming out this autumn, and it will probably not be about what you expect. As usual, thank you to my generous supporters over on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to my videos and can watch them without ads. And if you want to interact with fellow pirate enthusiasts, check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Cheerio!